Let me take you back to something I covered not too long ago. We talked about China quietly evacuating its citizens from Iran. Not loudly, not with press conferences or diplomatic statements, just quietly, efficiently, and without any real explanation to the world. At the time, a lot of people in the comments said it was precautionary. They said Beijing was just being careful, just protecting its people the way any responsible government would. And I understood that take, I really did. But something about the silence bothered me, because China does not do things quietly by accident. China does things quietly on purpose. So today I want to zoom out and connect some dots that I think a lot of mainstream commentary is missing. Because when you look at what Beijing has been doing over the last 18 months across the Middle East, you start to see a pattern, and that pattern is not the behavior of a country that is simply being cautious. It is the behavior of a country that has made a cold, calculated decision to redraw its alliances in one of the most volatile regions on Earth, and it is doing so without announcing it to anyone. The question I want to answer today is this. Why would China risk its $400 billion deal with Iran? Why would the country that brokered the most celebrated peace deal of 2023, the deal that brought Saudi Arabia and Iran back to the diplomatic table after years of bitter rivalry, why would that same country now appear to be quietly walking away from one side of that very deal? Is this a retreat? Is Beijing panicking? Or is this something far colder and far more deliberate than a panic? Is this a calculated gamble to position China not as a peacemaker for everyone, but as the indispensable partner for the winners? To understand where we are today, you have to go back to the spring of 2023. Because that moment was genuinely historic, and it is important to understand how significant it felt at the time. China sat down with Saudi Arabia and Iran, two countries that had spent years funding opposite sides of proxy wars across Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, and it got them to agree to restore diplomatic relations. Embassies would reopen, ambassadors would return. The language of the deal was warm and cooperative. For Beijing, this was a crowning diplomatic achievement. It sent a clear message to Washington and to the world. China could do what America had failed to do. China could bring stability to the Middle East, not through military force, not through aircraft carriers and sanctions, but through economic leverage and patient diplomacy. The narrative around the deal was that a new era of Chinese soft power had arrived. Commentators were writing that the days of American dominance in Gulf diplomacy were numbered. Beijing looked like the adult in the room. And for about 12 months that narrative held, but then reality started bleeding through the edges. Iran kept funding and supporting groups that were launching attacks across the region. The Houthis in Yemen, who received significant material and financial support from Tehran, began one of the most disruptive maritime campaigns in decades, targeting shipping in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. This directly threatened the flow of global trade. It directly threatened the economic interests of the Gulf states that China had just assured it could work with. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and the other Gulf monarchies watched this happen, and they looked at China and waited for Beijing to say something, to do something, to use its leverage with Tehran to pull back the chaos. China said almost nothing of substance, and that silence began to chip away at the image of China as the calm, reliable, powerful peacemaker, because a peacemaker has to actually make peace. A mediator has to have influence over all parties. What became increasingly clear to the Gulf states, and honestly to anyone paying close attention, was that China's influence over Iran was more limited than the 2023 deal had suggested. Tehran respected the relationship with Beijing because of the economic lifeline it provided under sanctions, but when it came to strategic decisions, to the fundamental question of whether Iran would continue to project power through its network of regional proxies, China had very little ability to say stop and be heard. Then came the tensions between Iran and Pakistan. This is a piece of the story that did not get nearly enough international attention, but it is absolutely critical to understanding what China is doing now. Iran and Pakistan, two countries that share a long and complicated border, exchanged military strikes in early 2024. Iran launched strikes inside Pakistani territory, claiming it was targeting militant groups. Pakistan responded. The relationship between the two countries deteriorated quickly and sharply, and Pakistan, which is home to the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, one of the most strategically vital infrastructure projects in Beijing's entire global investment plan, Pakistan began leaning harder into its relationships with the Gulf states. Around the same time, there were private conversations happening at the highest levels between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. A direct channel was opening between Riyadh and Islamabad that was specifically designed to deepen economic and security cooperation, and Beijing was watching all of this with great interest. Because here is the thing that I think is crucial to understand. China does not have a sentimental foreign policy. Beijing does not have permanent friends. It has permanent interests. And its interests in the Middle East have always been fundamentally about two things: energy security and the unimpeded flow of trade. Everything else, the peace deals, the diplomatic photo opportunities, the grand statements about a new model of international relations, all of that is in service of those two core interests. When the tools stop serving the interests, Beijing finds new tools, and Iran was starting to look like a tool that was causing more problems than it was solving. Think about it from Beijing's perspective. The $400 billion cooperation agreement signed with Tehran in 2021 promised China access to Iranian oil at discounted rates in exchange for massive infrastructure investment. That deal was supposed to lock in a long-term energy supply for China while giving Iran an economic partner capable of blunting the impact of American sanctions. On paper, it was a brilliant arrangement for both sides, but sanctions have tightened significantly. The banking infrastructure required to move serious money in and out of Iran remains deeply compromised by the American financial system's reach. Every Chinese company that invests heavily in Iran faces the risk of secondary sanctions, which means being cut off from the American market and from the dollar-based global financial system. And as much as China would like to accelerate the shift away from dollar dependence, that shift is not complete. Chinese banks and companies still need access to dollar networks. The cost of deep integration with Iran is rising, and the strategic return is becoming less reliable. Meanwhile, look at what Beijing has on the other side of the equation. The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia in particular, are swimming in capital and desperate for economic partnerships that can help them diversify their economies away from oil dependency. Vision 2030 in Saudi Arabia is essentially an open invitation for foreign investment. The infrastructure needs are enormous. The political will to spend is enormous. And crucially, the Gulf states are stable in ways that allow Chinese companies to actually execute projects, collect returns, and build lasting economic relationships. The China-Pakistan economic corridor is even more directly significant. This is not a peripheral investment. This corridor is China's literal physical gateway to the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean. It connects the western Chinese province of Xinjiang to the port of Gwadar on Pakistan's Balochistan coast. That port gives China a warm water outlet that bypasses the choke points it would otherwise be dependent on, particularly the Strait of Malacca, where American naval power creates a strategic vulnerability that keeps Chinese military planners awake at night. The economic corridor is the spine of China's regional strategy. If that spine is compromised, everything else suffers, and the spine is connected to Pakistan, and Pakistan is deepening ties with Saudi Arabia. So when China sees Iran and Pakistan at odds, when it sees Tehran's regional behavior destabilizing the very corridor it needs most, the calculation becomes less complicated than outsiders might think. Beijing is not going to publicly denounce Iran. It is not going to tear up the cooperation agreement or expel the Iranian ambassador. That is not how China operates, but it is going to quietly adjust where it puts its real weight. It is going to let the relationship with Tehran cool while warming up everything else, and that is exactly what is happening. Now I want to talk about the United States and Israel because you cannot understand China's behavior in the Middle East without understanding how Beijing reads the current American moment. And the picture Beijing sees when it looks at Washington right now is one of strategic distraction and political incoherence. The United States is deeply divided domestically in ways that affect its ability to project consistent foreign policy. The debates happening in Washington about the extent of American involvement in foreign conflicts, the tensions between different factions of the American political establishment over how much to commit to regional partners and how much to pull back, all of this is visible to Beijing, and all of it is being factored into China's calculations. When you have a situation where American political leaders are publicly disagreeing about the country's commitments to its own allies and partners, that creates space, that creates a vacuum. China is extraordinarily good at exploiting vacuums, not by rushing in loudly with troops and flags, but by positioning itself quietly and patiently so that when the dust settles, the countries left standing in the region find that Beijing is the most available, most capable, and least complicated major partner they have. The ongoing conflict involving Israel and the various Iran-backed groups across the region has created a situation where the United States is spending enormous political capital, diplomatic energy, and financial resources trying to manage multiple simultaneous crises. Every dollar of American diplomatic attention spent on one fire is a dollar not spent on something else. Every political crisis in Washington that pulls focus toward domestic drama is a moment where American engagement in the broader region becomes thinner and less reliable. China is deliberately choosing not to fill that gap with its own military presence or security guarantees. That might sound like weakness. It is not. It is strategy. Because Beijing understands something very important. The country that provides security guarantees also inherits security obligations. And security obligations are expensive, unpredictable, and politically costly. The United States has learned this lesson repeatedly and painfully across decades of Middle Eastern involvement. China has watched all of that and decided it does not want that particular burden. Instead, China wants to be the economic partner, the infrastructure builder, the quiet, reliable source of investment that does not come attached to demands about human rights or political reform or democratic governance. That offer is extraordinarily attractive to a large number of countries in the region, including countries that have grown frustrated with what they perceive as the conditional and sometimes hypocritical nature of Western partnership. By stepping back and letting the United States and Israel shoulder the burden of managing the immediate security crises, China is doing something quite clever. It is allowing American resources and attention to be consumed by the hardest and most thankless problems, while positioning itself to swoop in as the stable, business-minded partner for the countries that emerge from those crises, looking for new economic relationships. And here is the part that I think is the real strategic gamble. The gamble is not that China is giving up on Iran. The gamble is that China has decided Iran as it currently operates is not the version of Iran that will anchor the region's future stability. That is a significant bet, because Iran is not going away. Tehran still controls enormous territory, enormous resources, and an extensive network of regional influence. The idea that China can simply pivot away from Iran without consequences, without Tehran noticing and reacting, without the relationship souring in ways that damage Chinese interests, that is a genuine risk. There are things China might lose. It could lose preferred access to Iranian oil at the heavily discounted rates it currently enjoys under their bilateral arrangements. It could lose the diplomatic positioning that comes with being Tehran's primary great power patron. It could even face a situation where Iran begins warming up to Russia in ways that cut China out of certain regional arrangements entirely. These are real costs. Beijing knows this, but the calculation, the gamble, is that the gains outweigh those costs. That a more secure and deepened relationship with Saudi Arabia, the Gulf Cooperation Council states as a whole, and Pakistan, locked together through infrastructure investment and the economic corridor, creates a more durable and more profitable strategic position than continued close alignment with a sanctioned, isolated, and increasingly erratic Iran. The Sunni-led Arab bloc that Beijing is quietly courting is richer, more politically stable, more integrated into global trade flows, and more capable of being a long-term partner for the kind of infrastructure and energy investment that underpins China's global strategy. From a pure cost-benefit perspective, if you had to choose between anchoring your Middle Eastern strategy to Iran versus anchoring it to Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, the choice is not difficult. The only complication is the existing relationship with Tehran and the reputational cost of appearing to abandon it. China is managing that complication through silence, by saying nothing publicly, by maintaining the formal structures of the relationship with Iran, while reducing its actual depth and commitment. Beijing hopes to avoid triggering a dramatic rupture that would force everyone to choose sides and put China's broader regional positioning at risk. This is why the evacuation of Chinese citizens from Iran was so interesting and so telling. It was done quietly, no fanfare, no announcement, just a practical measure that happened to signal to anyone watching carefully that Beijing was adjusting its risk assessment regarding Tehran. It was not declaring an end to the relationship. It was hedging against the possibility that the relationship was going to get more complicated. And I want to be clear about something. This does not mean China has given up on Iran permanently. Beijing is not that sentimental, but it is also not that impulsive. If circumstances change, if Iran were to undergo a significant political transformation, if sanctions were dramatically eased through some diplomatic breakthrough, if Tehran's regional behavior shifted in ways that made it a more manageable partner, China would absolutely recalibrate. This is not ideology, this is not emotion, this is calculation. What China is doing right now is buying options. It is reducing its exposure to the highest risk elements of its Middle Eastern portfolio while increasing its stake in the elements that offer more predictable returns. It is the behavior of a long-term investor, not a panicked seller and not a reckless gambler. The real question, and I want to leave you with this to think about, is what does Beijing do if Iran's situation deteriorates significantly? If the pressure on Tehran becomes so severe that the current government faces an existential challenge, what does China do then? Does it step in to prevent a collapse that might empower American influence in the resulting vacuum? Or does it stand back and let events unfold, betting that whatever comes next in Iran will need China's economic partnership to survive? And there is a second, equally important question. The Gulf states and Pakistan are warming up to China right now, partly because of the vacuum created by American distraction. But what happens when American attention refocuses on the region? What happens when Washington decides it cannot afford to cede this ground to Beijing and re-engages with renewed energy and commitment? Will the relationships China is building now be deep enough and durable enough to survive that competition? Or will the Gulf states, always pragmatic and always looking for the best deal, simply pivot back toward Washington if America makes a compelling enough offer? China's strategic gamble is ultimately a bet on patience and economic leverage, defeating military presence and political alliance. It is a bet that the countries of the Middle East are tired enough of American conditionality and inconsistency that they will choose a different model of great power partnership. And it is a bet that Beijing can manage its exit from close alignment with Tehran smoothly enough that it does not trigger a crisis that undermines everything else it is building. Whether that bet pays off depends on factors that no one, not Beijing, not Washington, not Tehran, not Riyadh, can fully control. The Middle East has a way of producing surprises that upend the most careful strategic calculations. History in this region is littered with the wreckage of grand designs that looked brilliant on paper and fell apart in contact with reality. But right now, today, China's position in the Middle East is more nuanced and more strategically interesting than the simple narrative of the peacemaker or the opportunist can capture. Beijing is doing something harder and more sophisticated than either of those labels suggests. It is trying to be the one indispensable economic power in a region that is simultaneously too important to ignore and too chaotic to manage. It is trying to pick winners without appearing to abandon losers. It is trying to build the future while not destroying the present, and it is doing all of this as quietly as possible. Because in China's strategic worldview, the loudest actor in the room is rarely the most powerful one. So here is what I want to know from you. Do you think China's silence on Iran means Beijing has genuinely written Tehran off as a strategic partner? Or do you think this is a temporary recalibration, a tactical withdrawal while the dust settles, after which China will return to Iran with a new offer and a new plan? And perhaps most importantly, do you think the Gulf states and Pakistan are building a real long-term relationship with China? Or are they simply using Beijing's attention and investment while keeping their deeper strategic options open? Leave me your thoughts below, because this is exactly the kind of conversation that gets richer when more perspectives come in. And if this video gave you something to think about that you had not considered before, then share it with someone who you think would find it interesting. This is the kind of story that mainstream media is either missing entirely or only covering in fragments, and it deserves the full picture. I will see you in the next one.